WNYC Studios is supported by Odoo. When you buy business software from lots of vendors, the costs add up and it gets complicated and confusing. Odoo solves this. It's a single company that sells a suite of enterprise apps that handles everything from accounting to inventory to sales. Odoo is all connected on a single platform in a simple and affordable way. You can save money without missing out on the features you need. Check out Odoo at odoo.com. That's odoo.com.
It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. On yesterday's show, many of you heard, we talked about RFK Jr.'s testimony before 7 congressional committees last week. One of the issues we touched on was that members of the MAHA movement are becoming disillusioned with Kennedy and President Trump because the administration went soft on glyphosate, the active ingredient in the herbicide Roundup, one of the most widely used herbicides in the world, on home lawns and gardens as well as commercial agriculture. And as it happens, yesterday was also the day of Supreme Court oral arguments in a major case concerning glyphosate. So let's play a few clips from the hearing and take a closer look. Glyphosate has been linked to cancer by the World Health Organization. It's been the subject of tens of thousands of lawsuits and is a chemical that many scientists, environmental advocates, and public health researchers have been sounding the alarm about for a very long time. And yet, it is sprayed on crops across America, sold at every hardware store, and its label carries no cancer warning. That's because the EPA has not decided that it warrants one. The Supreme Court case revolves around a man named John Durnell. He spent 2 decades spraying Roundup around his neighborhood. He was later diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. A Missouri jury awarded Durnell over $1 million and found that Monsanto failed to warn him of the cancer risk. Now Monsanto, owned by German conglomerate Bayer, wants the Supreme Court to throw that verdict and that monetary award out. The Trump administration Solicitor General showed up to argue on Monsanto's side, even as RFK Jr., who once won a nearly $290 million verdict against Monsanto, sits in the cabinet and sits quietly by, or even in support. And the politics here are something. MAHA activists, the Make America Healthy Again movement that helped deliver Trump's 2024 win, largely because they like RFK, were outside the court yesterday chanting, "People versus poison," frustrated at the very administration they helped put in power. Tens of thousands of similar lawsuits, we should say, hang in the balance. So we'll talk about all this now with 2 guests. Lianne Sheppard is the Rohm and Haas Endowed Professor of Public Health at the University of Washington. Maureen Groppe covers the Supreme Court for USA Today. So we've got a legal expert and an environmental science expert. Maureen and Professor Sheppard, welcome to WNYC.
Hey, happy to be here.
Thank you for having me.
So the EPA says glyphosate is not likely to be carcinogenic. The World Health Organization says it's a probable carcinogen. Those are 2 of the most authoritative scientific bodies in the world, and they've reached opposite conclusions about the same chemical. Professor Sheppard, how is that possible?
Well, they did their reviews differently. They had different criteria, and EPA didn't even follow its own guidelines, so that their human health risk assessment was actually vacated by the Ninth Circuit Court much later. So I don't think we can believe the EPA's conclusion.
Take me a step further into that. If you are right, how did the EPA's method of deciding whether something is a likely carcinogen get so corrupted? This would have been before Trump, or no?
Yes, the review happened in 2016. I actually participated on the scientific advisory panel that did that review. EPA did not follow their own guidelines. There's also some nuances in what they were doing. First of all, they focused on dietary exposure, which is much lower than what landscapers and, for instance, Durnell was exposed to. People that spray it routinely as part of their work. And second of all, they focused on pure glyphosate, which nobody uses because what is sold is a glyphosate-based herbicide or a formulation which is mixed with surfactants and other so-called inert ingredients. They're inert because they're not the active ingredient of the pesticide, in this case the herbicide glyphosate, but they may not be inert from a health point of view.
But before we get to the legal issues with our other guest, you're talking about the Obama EPA. So I'm still curious how and why you think the EPA would not follow its own guidelines, would take, routes of exposure that don't reflect the real kinds of exposure that people have in the real world. I mean, why would they do that?
There's a lot of industry capture, particularly with respect to the Office of Pesticide Program at the EPA. There is a really good older article by Sharon Lerner called Department of Yes that goes into this in detail. And so there's just been very strong industry influence that has impacted the way that EPA has done its work.
Well, Maureen, the Supreme Court, as I understand it, is actually not being asked to decide whether glyphosate causes cancer. So what exactly is the legal question?
Yeah, that's right. The question that they have to answer is whether this federal law that regulates pesticides, regulates this herbicide, because the EPA, as your other guest said, has not determined that this causes cancer. Does that mean that that's what's controlling here, or can people like Mr. Durnell, can they sue under state law and say that the company failed to provide a cancer warning on their product? So the question is, does the federal regulation of this preempt the kind of lawsuit that Mr. Durnell and tens of thousands of other people have brought or want to bring?
Monsanto's lawyer is Paul Clement. Some of our listeners may know the name as a former U.S. Solicitor General. He said this in yesterday's oral arguments.
It's probably the most studied herbicide in the history of man, and they've all reached the conclusion based on more data and the kind of expert analysis they can do that there isn't a risk here. You shouldn't let a single Missouri jury second-guess that judgment.
And yet, to listen to a clip from history regarding RFK Jr., who was on the side of Monsanto in this case, he said this as recently as January.
I believe that glyphosate causes cancer.
So if you can put on a political analyst hat as well as a legal analyst hat, Maureen, how do those things fit together?
Well, I mean, that's this issue of whether this Roundup causes cancer is been hotly debated, and now it's become this interesting political issue too. As you mentioned, there were lots of people demonstrating outside the Supreme Court during the oral arguments. Before I went into the court to hear the arguments, I was able to speak to two of them, a couple who had come from Southern California, all the way from California, just to stand outside the court with their signs trying to say that this company should not get the liability protections. And I asked them if they were Trump supporters, and they said they were, and that they were very disappointed in the decision by his administration to back glyphosate. That the president has he has tried to push encourage domestic production of glyphosate. As you mentioned, the Justice Department was there arguing on behalf of the company in court, and that's a change in position from when the position the Justice Department took under the Biden administration. And right now, this in addition to this lawsuit, the company is trying to get legislation passed in states and in Congress to give them protection from liability, and that's causing problems for passage of farm bill legislation right now in Congress because of the controversy over whether the company should get this protection or not.
Professor Sheppard, for you as the environmental scientist here, do you have a take on RFK changing positions literally from January, when that clip was, to February, when Trump signed that executive order, and then Kennedy wrote this, the executive order to boost domestic glyphosate production. And Kennedy wrote, President Trump did not build our current system. He inherited it. I support President Trump's executive order to bring agricultural chemical production back to the United States and end our near total reliance on adversarial nations. So suddenly he wasn't talking about whether it causes cancer. He was talking about what nations get over on us on economic production, right?
I find it hard to speak for how and why he changed his position. I think that the health evidence is clear. Glyphosate and glyphosate-based herbicides cause cancer. The comprehensive evidence supports this conclusion, and the strongest evidence is for an increased risk of non-Hodgkin lymphoma, which is a cancer of the lymphatic system. But there's also other evidence that it increases the risk of multiple other adverse health effects. And particularly, it's notable that children, infant, and fetuses are the most susceptible. So that's the perspective that I hold, and I can't speak for why he changed his mind and his tune.
You mentioned non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which keeps coming up in these lawsuits, including in John Darnell's case that's now before the Supreme Court. Is there something specific about the biology of glyphosate that would make it particularly linked to that type of cancer? Do you know the mechanism, or is the association more statistical, only statistical at this point, and you can't say exactly how?
There's an emerging hypothesis that I think is quite powerful, that glyphosate sequesters in bone, and that is where the cancer forms, and that's why blood cancers are the most likely cause of cancer. It's quite clear that that glyphosate is genotoxic, and so yeah, it's emerging that the blood cancers are probably the most important ones. It has a very short half-life in the body, and so you should pee out like most of it in about 6-8 hours. Yet glyphosate is detected in the urine of 70 to 80% of all the U.S. population. That's based on NHANES data. So an important question is, why are we all showing evidence of glyphosate in our bodies when the half-life is so short, if most of us are exposed predominantly through diet? So, and one of the reasons may be that it's sequestering in bone and coming out more slowly, and this is where the mechanism for non-Hodgkin lymphoma is happening.
Well, if so much of the U.S. population has glyphosate in their blood, and yet a very small percentage comes down with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, is that an argument for or against the association?
Well, it makes it challenging to uncover the evidence scientifically. But let me talk to you about what it means from a public health point of view. I believe that unless we're really strict organic diet people, we are being microdosed with glyphosate all the time through our diet. And the public health impact, let's say that 1 in a million people will get non-Hodgkin lymphoma from their low-dose dietary exposure. Yet 1 in 1,000 landscapers who spray it all the time, get it on their skin or around it, or get a much higher dose, are going to get non-Hodgkin lymphoma. But in the country, there's 300 million people that eat every day, more than that, but say that's how many are eating a non-organic diet. That's 300 excess cases of cancer. Yet there's only, say, 10,000 landscapers, so that's only 10 landscapers that are going to get non-Hodgkin lymphoma. It's a lot easier scientifically to show the link between the landscapers' exposure and non-Hodgkin lymphoma because of the
and do you think that's
the
been
higher
shown?
Dose.
Because it's certainly those workers who are at the most risk. Has that been epidemiologically proven?
The highest Well, epidemiology is a science that shows associations, so proving the link is extremely challenging. That said, that the strongest evidence is in the people that are most highly exposed. That's why the agricultural health study, the study is pesticide applicators. That's what the evidence in the epidemiologic study shows is the highest exposed people are the highest
All right.
risk and the highest strongest association.
Maureen, back to you as the Supreme Court reporter. Monto's big argument is uniformity, and again, the justices aren't going to rule on whether glyphosate causes cancer. They're going to rule on this uniformity argument that you can't have 50 states or 50 different juries, in this case it was a Missouri court ruling, setting their own standards on warning labels. Chief Justice Roberts pressed them on that.
Yeah, we heard probably the strongest voice of support for Monsanto's position came from Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who, as you said, kept raising this uniformity issue. But more than once, the Chief Justice, John Roberts, another fellow conservative, he kept probing whether states have any role. The idea that they have no role in this, he probed that more than once, and also Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, one of the liberals, joined him in that and brought up the fact that the EPA is required only 15 years to update the standards, and of course they're delayed. They still have not performed the most recent update. They're behind in that. So the Chief Justice was saying, well, it's not necessarily the case that these state courts are doing something different from what the EPA is doing. Maybe it's just that they are being more responsive to changing information, new information about this product.
Right, and it's interesting that you cited that because that's the one clip of Chief Justice Roberts that we pulled, which makes him sound like he's on the side of Missouri, not the Trump administration. Let's listen.
It's not necessarily the case that they're doing something inconsistent with what EPA would do. It's simply a fact that they're responsive to the new information more quickly than the federal government is.
So, Maureen, do you have a take, as sometimes Supreme Court reporters do after oral arguments, as to where this is headed?
Yeah, it was hard for me to say for sure. You have to count to five. Five is the majority on the court, and it's always tricky to judge from oral arguments because the Chief Justice in particular, he likes to ask tough questions of both sides. So I think myself and many other of the reporters who were covering the oral arguments yesterday came away not sure which way they're going to go. And even if things can change, even if you hear in oral arguments, you think it sounds like they're going to go one direction. When they sit down, whatever justice is assigned to write this decision, when he or she sits down to write it, sometimes things can change based on, they're trying to write the justification and in the process, I think, well, I'm not sure they might change their mind, or one of the other justices might change their mind and change, who's in the majority and which side is in the minority. So there was no clear indication to me from the oral arguments about how the justices are going to rule.
So, Professor Sheppard, you'll get the last question. Let's say this goes Monsanto's way and the Trump administration's way. What's the next line of, I guess, activism for people like yourself who think glyphosate is carcinogenic or otherwise hazardous, to try to protect landscapers or anybody else?
As a public health professional, I'm concerned not as an activist, but just about communicating the evidence to the public so that they can protect themselves. And I think even now, people can be smart about how they use the product if they choose to spray it around their home, and make sure that they wear chemically resistant gloves and protect their skin from exposure and not get it in their eyes, not ingest it. And from a dietary point of view, if you can afford it, eat an organic diet. If you can't afford it, be selective about the foods that you choose to eat organic, and particularly stay away from the foods that tend to be used, that tend to be exposed to glyphosate right before they're harvested. Those are the pre-harvest desiccation foods like oats, wheat, legumes like chickpeas. So those are the ones to prioritize for organic diet.
Lianne Sheppard is the Rohm and Haas Endowed Professor of Public Health at the University of Washington. Maureen Groppe covers the Supreme Court for USA Today. Thank you both very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for having me.
Brian Lara on WNYC. Senator Cory Booker next. Stay with us.
WNYC Studios is supported by AT&T. Summer. It's when we share more time, more memories, and more photos. And at AT&T, the iPhone 17 Pro is your summer essential. Its center stage front camera auto-adjusts the frame to fit everyone into group selfies. Right now at AT&T, you can get iPhone 17 Pro for $0 with eligible iPhone trade-in, any condition. Required trade-in of iPhone 15 Plus or higher, excluding iPhone 16e and 17e. Required eligible plan. Terms and restrictions apply. Subject to change. Visit att.com/iPhone or visit an AT&T store for details.